So, solutions for a sustainable and desirable future. Now, some people have been saying that the word sustainability has been being overused a bit these days. So, if you use Google's Ngram and you plot the frequency of use of the word sustainability over the last several years up to the present day, and you plot that on a log scale, then by the year 2109, all language will just be the word sustainability used over and over again in all sentences. So it's become quite popular, and I think that's a good sign. It's actually not quite that bad. This is actually, if you look at the Ngram viewer and plot sustainability, and I plotted a few other words: ecology, economics, economic growth over time. Sustainability is the blue one. So it has started to level off, but it is more popular these days than economic growth or ecology. And it's almost caught up with economics. So, but what I want to talk about today is how do we actually solve some of the complex problems that we're facing around sustainability, but not just creating a sustainable world, but one that's also desirable, one that is a higher quality of life than we have today. And I think linking those two terms is really what we're after. What do we mean by a desirable world? How do we talk about quality of life, et cetera? To solve any sort of practical, complex problems, I think requires these three elements of having a vision, an adequate vision, not only of how the world works, our scientific paradigms, and certainly these are changing quite rapidly as we learn more about the biophysical world, and also as we learn more about human psychology, and particularly what contributes to human well-being. But also we need to have a vision of how we would like the world to be, our positive vision for the future. And this has been shown to be quite an effective way to get change in many kinds of organizations, from businesses to communities, et cetera. So how do we envision a better world and make that consistent with what we now know about the reality of the world? How do we build tools and analytical techniques that are consistent with that? And how do we develop implementation strategies, institutions, policies, et cetera, that are all consistent with that emerging vision? And I think we do need to change our vision going forward because we are in what some have called even a whole new geologic era, the Anthropocene. We're not in the Holocene any longer, we're in the Anthropocene because of the magnitude of human influence on the planet. So for example, the science of complex systems is showing us that these systems are nonlinear, they have thresholds, they have tipping points, they have surprises. The world doesn't necessarily behave in a nice, smooth way, and we have to take that into account. This is from a paper by Tim Linton and others back in 2008, where they tried to identify some of the tipping points in the climate system. And the most well-known is the melting of the ice sheets, but there are several other potential changes that could cause a very rapid shift in the climate and cause us some real surprises that we have to be aware of. We also know that there are fundamental resource constraints. Production of oil and gas is not going to continue at the same rate forever. We're, if not at, probably close to peak oil. And the real important part is that the net energy from oil and gas liquids is probably going to decline, is declining quite rapidly as the resources we're going after get much harder to extract. And so if you subtract the energy cost of drilling in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico or extracting tar sands or fracking, the net energy is scheduled to go down. So we do face some fundamental resource constraints, and we face some fundamental ecological boundaries or constraints, planetary boundaries as they're now called. I was involved in this paper that came out in Nature recently where a large group of us tried to identify what are the fundamental planetary boundaries. We identified 9 boundaries, including 3 that we thought were already well past the safe operating space: climate change, biodiversity loss, and the nitrogen cycle. Several others are rapidly approaching the safe operating space. So it's kind of a re-acknowledgement that we live on a finite planet. We cannot continue to exceed these planetary boundaries without repercussions. Now, of course, this is not the movie that most people want to line up to go see. These kinds of truths are inconvenient. I think the environmental community has largely taken a sort of negative approach, a scare approach to these issues, saying that we have to stop doing what we're doing. But I think, in fact, we need a third movie. We need to develop a positive future, because I think we can have a much higher quality of life, and at the same time staying within our planetary boundaries. If we rethink our vision not only of how the world works, but also the kind of world that we really want. So we need to develop a sustainable and desirable economy in society, in nature, as we're calling it. And that is the title of the chapter that we produced. It's also the title of a report that we did for the UN in preparation for the Rio +20 meeting. I have one hard copy of that report if anybody wants to take a look at that, but you can also download it from the website over here. And the idea for that was to say, well, can we outline what that economy in society and nature, recognizing the embeddedness of the economy in the larger society. We don't believe, as Margaret Thatcher did, that there's no such thing as society. We believe that there is a society, there is a culture, there is social capital, there is nature, there is natural capital, and we can't understand and build a sustainable and desirable economy without understanding that embeddedness and how those parts of the system all interact with each other. A shorter version of that UN report is what is being published as a chapter in the State of the World 2013. The World Watch Institute has been doing the State of the World report, I don't know for how many years now, 20 or so years. So every year they come up with a State of the World. This one is titled, Is Sustainability Still Possible? And there's a list of the authors in this volume. I think it's about 40 or so chapters. We didn't manage to get any hard copies of this report yet. It's just being launched officially in Washington, D.C. Today, or actually tomorrow by their time, but today, so it's on April 16th. So we're a little bit ahead of the curve, and I do have one hard copy if somebody wants to come up and take a peek. But I do also have some order forms for the full book. So you're entitled, by being here at this lecture, to a 20% discount. Congratulations. And it has some really interesting chapters in addition to ours. I think you'll appreciate many of the other chapters in this report. So we've also been working recently with the country of Bhutan, which is a really interesting case study. Their national policy goal is gross national happiness, not gross national product. You may have heard that. They actually got a resolution passed through the UN in July of last year that was unanimously sponsored by all the countries there, that based on happiness toward a holistic approach to development. So they're in a unique position of not having been really in the Western world up until fairly recently. And they can step back and say, well, what kind of development do we really want? Do we want the standard Western model of rapid economic growth and GDP growth, or do we want something that's based a little more on a broader conception of well-being and happiness? So we were engaged by Bhutan to sort of help develop a report for them back to the UN in 2014 to sort of flesh out what this new paradigm might look like. And we had a meeting in Thimphu, the capital, a few months ago, beginning in January, February, and see if you recognize any of the people in this picture. And if not, I'll point them out to you. Let's see if I can use this. Right, so here's me. This is Ida Kubishevsky standing over there on the wall. She's also newly appointed at the Crawford School and is the managing editor of Solutions, among other things. And this guy here you might also recognize. Martin. This is the Prime Minister of Bhutan and the King and Queen of Bhutan. So it has a sort of royal mandate to put together. This is some other people you might recognize. David Suzuki was there, and Hunter Lovins, and Jackie McGlade, the head of the European Environment Agency. This is Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, who I'll say a little bit more about their work on inequality going forward. So we had a chance to meet with at least one head of state who I think understands that growth at all costs is not really the goal that they're pursuing, but how do we do a better job of balancing economic production and other contributors to well-being. This is the oops, sorry. The Queen of Bhutan holding up a copy of Solutions. So, let's see what happens. There. So, one way of thinking about this is that we've moved from a relatively empty world, empty of humans and their artifacts. We had a lot of natural capital, and to a more full world. And the empty world, in that vision of the economy, I think it was, this is a simplification, but this is some of the basic elements. We had land, labor, and capital, primary factors of production. We produce goods and services measured by GDP, and those are either consumed in the current period or reinvested so we can make more capital so we can produce and consume more going forward. So there's nothing in this vision that limits the economy from growing forever. There's the assumption of perfect substitutability between these factors of production, so we don't really need natural resources. We can always substitute more labor or capital for those. Since we're talking about private goods and services or marketed goods and services, we don't really need the public. Everything should be private property rights. That's the solution to these problems. I mean, the market will solve all of our problems. So the fundamental presumptions under this view is more is always better. We don't have to worry about distribution of income. A bigger pie we can split more easily around everybody. Consumption is the main contributor to individual welfare or utility. And private property is the way to go. I think we need to change that vision going forward, to recognize what we now know about the elements of the world, this full world vision, recognizing that we live in a materially closed Earth system. You can't have a materially growing economy, forever on a finite planet. So that growth in throughput has to come to an end at some point. It recognizes that these four basic types of capital or assets are all required in a more balanced way to produce any sort of benefits, either conventional economic production, but also direct benefits that are not going through the conventional economic system. That they're not infinitely substitutable for each other. They're required in some sort of balanced way. So in addition to conventional built capital, human capital, people, and their labor, but also their health, their education as individuals, and social capital, all the groups of people, all of our formal and informal networks and our institutions, the market itself is a form of social capital. And then our natural capital, everything else out there of which these things are built ultimately, and which contributes to well-being both as an input to conventional production, but also through what are called ecosystem services, direct benefits to people's well-being. It also embodies our sort of growing knowledge about what's called positive psychology, or the science of happiness. What actually does contribute to human well-being, recognizing that that is far more than simply the more we consume, the better off we are. In fact, beyond a certain point, it's clear that it's relative consumption that's more important to people's well-being than absolute consumption. And there's a whole range of other contributors, our participation in our society. And this was an attempt to put together some of the basic elements that lead to quality of life. There's been a lot of work, as I said, in the positive psychology on surveying people's well-being, asking them, how satisfied are you with your life? There's even a version where they monitor Twitter feeds, or the words that people tweet to each other, and give each of them a happiness score, and then you can get sort of a real-time, readout of what the relative happiness of a population is. And you can see when the football team wins and things go way up, and on Sunday it's high and Monday it's low. that's only really a part of it. That's sort of the short-term, happiness. And I think when we're talking about happiness, well-being, it's really a much longer-term thing that includes meeting a whole range of basic human needs, including subsistence, consumption, etc. But also, it's clear that there's a much longer list here, and this is not the only list, but it definitely includes things like security and affection and participation in decision making and having enough leisure time and creativity and freedom, etc. So there's a bigger list of human needs. What we can do from a policy perspective, I think, is to create the opportunities for people to meet those needs by how we arrange our assets, and all of our assets, our built, our human, our social, our natural capital, and how we use our time. So I'll emphasize a bit today the natural and a little bit more the social capital aspects, and not worry so much about the conventional economic components. But I think they're all important, as I said, in a more balanced way, and I think that's our challenge going forward. Natural capital produces ecosystem services, the benefits that people derive from functioning ecosystems. There was a report called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment you may have read a few years ago that categorized these services into these 4 major groups of provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services, and all the various ways that they contribute to human well-being. I want to emphasize, though, that the contribution of natural capital to ecosystem services is not something that just happens directly. It's something that requires an interaction with these other 3 forms of capital. So you can't really understand ecosystem services just by studying ecology. I mean, that's going to tell you about how natural systems function, but it doesn't tell you how those systems functioning benefits human well-being. To do that, you have to build a much more transdisciplinary approach that includes the interaction with the other 3 types of capital, and how these things function over time to get at the sustainability part of it. This idea of ecosystem services, I think, has become very popular recently. In particular, there's something called the Ecosystem Services Partnership that I've been involved in trying to set up. And this is an effort to bring together the literally thousands, I think, of individuals and groups around the world now working on this idea of ecosystem services. You can take a look at their website. And it's an attempt to really have a one-stop shop where people could go and find out about other people working in this area and what they're doing, etc. Myself and Ida organized the 5th annual meeting of this partnership in Portland, Oregon last August, and the 6th meeting will be in Bali at the end of August of this year. So I encourage you all to take a look at that and maybe meet us in Bali. So when we talk about those services, then one idea is, well, how much are they contributing? What's the value of those services relative to other contributors, relative to the contributions of other forms of capital? And I think this idea of valuing ecosystem services, we certainly do it all the time anyway. I mean, it's not something we can avoid, because every time we make a decision that has some implications for the environment, we are implicitly assigning a value to those services and everything that they produce. But in fact, we're doing it largely in ignorance of what those services are. So how do we do a better job of really valuing those services? And there's a whole range of uses for that valuation exercise as well, starting from simply raising awareness and interest about the topic. How do we make it clear that these things are valuable, that nature is not just a luxury good, it's not just something that we can do without if we run out of money. It's something that really underlies the entire economic system, and also a whole range of other benefits, as the Millennium Assessment graph pointed out. There's also a lot of interest now to revising national income and well-being accounts to include the benefits that come from natural capital and ecosystem services, to answer specific policy and land use questions. So if we are proposing to make some changes in land use or other policies, what are the implications for the loss or gain of benefits versus other things that we're gaining or losing. This idea of payment for ecosystem services has also become quite popular. that in Costa Rica, for example, they've managed to reforest the entire country by paying landowners to plant and maintain forests rather than run cattle on their land. And the rationale for that is that the forests provide hydrologic services, tourism benefits, et cetera, this whole range of services that we talked about. And that idea has also become quite popular in many other places. This idea of full cost accounting, how can we bring in the damages to ecosystem services and other effects into the accounting system for companies to affect prices, et cetera. And finally, this idea of common asset trust. So I think we need different kinds of institutions to better manage ecosystem services and social capital. I'll say a little bit more about that as we go forward. One example about the full cost accounting is this company that I've been involved with as chair of the advisory board called TrueCost. And what TrueCost tries to do is to estimate the external environmental costs of companies' activities. Puma has recently employed them to do an environmental profit and loss statement, and several other companies are beginning to do something more like that. But they're able to evaluate the whole spectrum of companies in the FTSE 500 and the Dow Jones, and according to a quantitative estimate of their external environmental costs. They do that using an input-output framework. So they're looking at all of the various sectors in the economy, all of the ecosystem services and extractions that are being provided, all of the negative impacts of those companies' operations. So they can get an estimate of both the direct impacts on the environment, on ecosystem services and human health, but also the indirect impacts through company supply chains. And they can begin to evaluate, well, how do we reduce our impacts? Do we change our suppliers, or do we change our operations? And how can we begin to take those kinds of things into account? Ultimately, if we had a system that priced those negative and positive impacts, and we'd have a much closer approximation to the truth among all of the prices that we're facing in the marketplace. So our current market prices are certainly not giving an accurate or true picture of what the true costs of things are. So when we're talking about the value of ecosystem services in this framework, we're talking about the contribution that they have made to marketed goods and services. We're talking about the inputs that they have to various economic activities. But we're also talking about the direct, non-marketed services that they provide to households that are never picked up in the market in any way. This idea of ecosystem services, I said, in the academic community has been rapidly expanding. This is from the ISI Web of Knowledge, and this is the number of publications that have come out over the last several decades on the term ecosystem services. You can see that it's up around over 1,000 academic papers published, and just the ones that ISI covers per year, with lots of over 20,000 citations per year to each of those papers. So it's a very active area of research. If you look on ISI, the most highly cited of those papers is this one. That I had something to do with. We tried back in 1997 to estimate, the total value of all of these services. It was a crude first approximation, admittedly, but I think it's still a very conservative estimate. And we came up with, numbers in the trillions of dollars, 16 to 54 trillion, an average of about $33 trillion, much larger than global GDP at the time. And it was done simply by trying to estimate the average value per hectare for each of these biomes and multiplying by the area of those biomes to get a total value and adding that up. Crude first approximation, but as I said, something that is in the category of one of the first purposes that I mentioned of raising awareness and interest, and it certainly has had that effect. More recently, we have updated some of those unit values. So there's been a lot more work since 1997 on estimating the value, per hectare of this whole range of ecosystem services. And this is from a paper in a new journal called Ecosystem Services that's completely devoted to this topic that looks at how those unit values have changed. And we're working on an update that takes the changes in land use that have occurred since 1997 and updating them along with the unit values to begin to estimate the distribution of those ecosystem services currently. This is it's a complicated table. I'm not expecting you to read any of this, but this is similar to the simpler table I put up, but looking at changes in land area, changes in unit values, and what that means for the aggregate total. So this is the original aggregate total with the 97 unit values and land area, just updated to 2007 dollars. This is if we change only the unit values and don't change the land area. So we just update the unit values, we get this number. Quite a large increase in value just from, we know more about what those values are. If we change only the area, so if we assume the same unit values as 1997, just update the area, we get this number, significantly smaller than the original. So land area change has led to a decrease in the supply of ecosystem services. And if we change both, we get this number. So you can think about using the 97 estimates of unit values. We're estimating a $4.3 trillion loss of services based on land use change. If you use the updated unit values, you get a 20 or so trillion dollar per year loss in ecosystem services based on how we've changed land use. We basically are losing some of our very high value ecosystem services or ecosystems and the services associated with them and converting them to fairly low value services. We know when we do that, that there is a significant loss of those services. When we make the transition, for example, from intact wetlands to farming, or sustainable forestry to farming, or mangroves to shrimp farming, or traditional forest use to unsustainable timber harvest. This is from the Millennium Assessment again. We're losing social value. We may be gaining private value, but we're certainly losing quite a lot of social value. A few years ago, we did an estimate of the benefit-cost ratio of conserving our wild natural assets by assuming a scenario where we expand the global reserve network to cover 15% of the terrestrial biosphere, 30% of the marine biosphere. That would cost about $45 billion per year to establish and maintain. And the net benefits would be on the order of $4 to $5 trillion per year. So a benefit-cost ratio of 100 to 1, conservatively estimated. The only better benefit-cost ratio I've been able to find is for oil companies investing in political campaigns in the United States, which is unfortunately about 400 to 1. So for many of these purposes, it's important to aggregate up these values to make some decisions about land use change, just to point out the relative magnitude of these changes. I think it can have quite an interesting effect. There are several ways to do that, and I'll talk briefly about some of these. What we did for the Nature paper and the update was called basic value transfer. We just assume a constant value per unit area and multiply that by the area. We can modify that with expert knowledge of the variation within a land use on the quality and the quantity of services provided. We can do a more statistical approach if we have enough value estimates to build a statistical model and relate those values to other aspects of the system, spatial patterns, proximity to human settlements, etc. Or we can do a more elaborate, sort of spatially explicit functional modeling approach, which I think is where the direction that we're trying to go in to get better estimates of how the natural systems are connected to human well-being. I'll run through one very quick example, just to give you an idea of how some of these values might be estimated. This is a paper we did to estimate the value of coastal wetlands for storm protection. This is Hurricane Katrina approaching Louisiana. We know, for example, the historical paths of all the hurricanes and cyclones over the last several decades. We were initially going to do this study globally, but we could only get enough good data for the US at the time. We were hoping now to expand the study to include Australia and Mexico and perhaps China. But basically, We can assemble the data on the swath of the hurricane, the wetland area in the swath, the GDP in the swath. We got this from nighttime satellite imagery that's able to sort of distribute GDP spatially. We knew the damages that were caused by the hurricane. We knew the intensity, the maximum wind speed of the hurricane. So we could build a simple regression model that would relate the relative damages to wind speed and wetland area. And from that, we can estimate the avoided damages. What's the change in damages as we increase or decrease the wetland area. And so we can explain about 60% of the relative damages using that approach and the hurricanes that we had data for. And we can use that then to map both this is the area of wetlands, this is the marginal value for the wetlands per hectare, and then we can integrate under that curve and get the total value of the wetlands just for the storm protection services in US dollars per square kilometer. You can see that the highest values are where you have those three variables interacting, where you have a lot of hurricanes to be protected from, you have a lot of infrastructure to protect, and you have a lot of wetlands to do the protection. So bottom line is you get fairly large numbers in the, there's quite a range, but fairly high median and mean values in the thousands of dollars per hectare per year. And if you add it all up, you get about $23 billion per year just in the storm protection services of these coastal wetlands. Now you have all these other services that coastal wetlands are also providing that artificial engineered structures are not. So the Corps of Engineers' first reaction to Hurricane Katrina was, well, let's just build a big levee all along the whole coast of Louisiana. And that would certainly cost a lot of money. It would not provide anything other than storm protection. It wouldn't even do a very good job of that. And so I think they're becoming convinced now that they'd be much better off investing in natural capital as the way to do this multiple tasks, including storm protection. The other interesting feature, I think, is to recognize that ecosystem services are not private goods. They're not rival and excludable like most market goods. Rival meaning one person's benefiting from a good or service prevents other people from also benefiting. If I eat a tomato, you can't eat the same tomato. But if I benefit from a good climate, that doesn't prevent you from also benefiting from a good climate or many of the other services. So excludable is the degree to which these services you can prevent someone from benefiting unless they pay you. So they're often non-rival and non-excludable services. Most ecosystem services, I think, fit into these other three categories. And the market, I think, does a relatively good job of allocating goods and services that fit into this category, but not so good in the services that fit into the other three categories. So how do we begin to build institutions that can do a better job with those kinds of services? I'm not sure how well you can see this one, but another project I'm involved with is called IHOPE, the Integrated History and Future of People on Earth. This is an attempt to take a much longer historical perspective and incorporate what we're learning about the environmental history of Earth and integrate that with what we know about human history in order to better understand sustainability in the first case, what has led to the sustainability or collapse of historical civilizations, and what influence has the environment had on both the survivability and the well-being of historical societies. This graph plots a whole range of variables on a log scale from 100,000 years ago up to the present, and broken down into the Pleistocene, the Holocene, and the Anthropocene. The Pleistocene ended about 10,000 years ago when temperature, the red line, which had been quite erratic over most of the Pleistocene, going from ice ages to interglacial periods, stabilized at a fairly warm and wet level, and in a sense allowed the development of human civilization as we know it. All of these graphs are growth in GDP and CO2 emissions and et cetera, human population. We're now pushing this line off the long-term average, and I guess that's the implications are, what does that mean for not only conventional economic production, but also for ecosystem services. This is from a paper by John Deering and others where they tried to reconstruct from pollen records and sediment cores the ecosystem services in the Yangtze River Basin from 1930 up until about the year 2000. And they were able to get this range of services with some sort of proxy measures on them and an overall ecosystem service index that they then related to political changes and climate changes, et cetera. So being able to understand the longer term behavior of this complex system gives us a lot of advantages, including our ability to better understand these complex relationships and use that information to help build a more sustainable future. I think going forward, we need then a better idea of what and a better ability to do integrated modeling of humans embedded in ecological systems. So it's not enough to model each part of the system separately. We need a much more integrated modeling approach and it's not going to be any one right way to do this. We need what I call intelligent pluralism in this approach at multiple scales in space and time and complexity. And also using the modeling process as a way to build consensus around these complex issues, getting large groups of people from different disciplines, from different policy perspectives to participate in actually constructing these models, acknowledging uncertainty, acknowledging the value of those stakeholders, and acknowledging the long-term evolutionary dynamics of these processes. One example that we did a few years ago was this model called GUMBO, the Global Unified Model of the Biosphere, where we tried to do a dynamic simulation of the whole global system, focused on this issue of ecosystem services and how they change over time, how they're influenced by what goes on and what kind of investment and policy decisions are made in the anthroposphere and what's happening to the climate, et cetera. You can also do this at a more detailed landscape scale, more spatially explicit scale, where a lot of our policy decisions are really focused. And there's a whole field of landscape simulation modeling that's able to build these kinds of models that have this interaction built into them. One approach that we're working on is to take a more variable resolution approach, so multi-scale integrated models that have all of these components embedded in them, but that also can be done at a spatially explicit way over multiple scales, from small watersheds all the way up to the global scale. One interesting recent example I've been involved with this guy, Scott Heckbert, is to try to model the Maya civilization and both the growth and the collapse of the Maya civilization, and in a spatially explicit way. This is over a 600-year time frame with population, forest condition as a proxy for ecosystem services, and the trade strength or trade network. And he's able, with this model, to reproduce the resilience of the system to a couple of drought cycles, but also the eventual collapse of the system when they had a drought cycle, when the system was in a very brittle state, if you will, when it was over connected. So what can we learn from those kinds of simulations? We're actually trying to go back now and say, well, what could the Maya have done to prevent this collapse? Could they have controlled population a little more, or controlled their resource depletion, or moderated their trade network? And what does this mean for our current situation and its sustainability? Okay, so that's the natural capital part. I think the social capital part is equally important, if not more important. And this is from the book by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. I showed you their picture earlier, called The Spirit Level, where they've looked at the relationship between income inequality and this index of social problems that they've created, including this whole range of different social issues: trust, life expectancy, imprisonment rates, etc. Very strong statistical relationship between more inequality, worse social problems. The US is way up here. Australia is down here, somewhere in the middle. Scandinavia and Japan are down on this side. So if you really want to improve quality of life, this is one essential feature that we've been tending to ignore, by assuming that more is always better. This is an interesting study out of Harvard, where they asked 5,000 Americans what they thought the distribution of wealth was in the country. They thought it was like this. This is the top 20%, the next 20%, the bottom 20%. They compared that with what it really is, which is more like this. The bottom 20%, you can hardly see it all on this graph. and the top 20% are more than 80% of the wealth. And then they also asked them what they would like it to be. And across the board, across the whole political spectrum, this was really interesting. It didn't vary by Republicans or Democrats. They all thought that the wealth distribution should be more like this. And this is actually a pretty close approximation to the wealth distribution in Sweden, not in the United States. And if you asked Americans, you want to be like Swedes? Their first reaction is probably no. But if you dig below the surface and say, what kind of wealth distribution do you think is really optimal? And Wilkinson and Pickett have pointed out that it's not just the people at the bottom that suffer from this kind of wealth distribution. It's the whole distribution, because it prevents the development of community, of social capital, and leads to this whole range of other social problems. We know that the relationship between GDP per capita and mean life satisfaction, so if you ask people how satisfied are they with their life, we know that this levels off after a certain point. That the USA is not any happier really than Costa Rica or Venezuela, even though they're orders of magnitude almost difference in GDP per capita. There have been some, so we know that GDP is it was never really designed as a measure of well-being or welfare. It's just measuring marketed activity, and some of that activity is not really contributing to well-being. If there's an oil spill, somebody has to go clean it up. That's more GDP. So there have been some alternatives suggested. This is one called the Genuine Progress Indicator, a version of the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare. It starts with personal consumption expenditures, but then it weights those by income distribution to account for this fact that a dollar's worth of income to a rich person doesn't produce as much welfare as a dollar's worth to a poor person. It adds a couple things that are left out: household labor, volunteer work, obviously good things, but left out of GDP. It subtracts a whole range of things that are really costs: the cost of crime, the cost of family breakdown, unemployment, commuting, and all these things in green are environmental costs, cost of air and water pollution and noise pollution. Interestingly, if you plot that, if you index for the United States from 1950 to the late 2004 in this case, you see that GDP was going up the whole time. GPI was tracking it for a while, but after about 1978 or so, it leveled off and hasn't really been improving. So we're in a period of what Herman Daly has called uneconomic growth. The economy is growing, it's not really economic because it's not really improving welfare. Again, GPI is not the perfect indicator, but the state of the state of Maryland has recently adopted GPI as one of their main guiding statistics, and are starting to think more about what are the impacts of our policies on GPI rather than just GDP. They have a very good website. I encourage you to go take a look at that. It really explains this index and all of the different elements, and also the kinds of policies that they're implementing to try to improve the elements of GPI. So they come out with press releases that are saying what's happening now to their GPI rather than their GDP. Okay. I'm getting there. We're working on a paper now that tries to survey what's happened in 17 different countries for which the GPI has been estimated, and comparing that with some other indicators going forward. These are all index numbers. This is for the US. You can see this correlation between GPI and GDP up until about the 78, and then they start diverging, and what's happening with some other indicators. This is the same plots for China, and you can see that even though China's GDP has been going through the roof, literally, GPI after about 1995 has leveled off and is pretty much stable, similarly to what happened in the US. If you look at all of the 17 countries for which GPI has been estimated, you get graphs like this. Interestingly, Australia is this one at the top of the list. So things here are actually doing pretty well. In fact, they're actually improving a bit over this last period, contrary to most other countries. But Australia is a relatively small country. When you put all this together and come up with an estimate of the global GPI per capita versus GDP per capita, you get something that looks a lot like the US picture, where globally haven't really been improving well-being since about the mid-70s, because all of those external costs of growth are now beginning to outweigh the benefits, and we're not taking those into account. So we're recognizing we need to stay within these planetary boundaries, but we also need to provide the elements of human well-being and quality of life, and create what Kate Raworth has called the sustainable and desirable donut. So how do we get into and stay in the donut and balancing out those forces? We know that the dimensions of this new economy include these three basic elements of a sustainable scale that respects those planetary boundaries, make sure that we don't exceed them, a fair distribution that protects the capabilities for flourishing, and a more efficient allocation that includes all of the resources that contribute to well-being, including natural and social capital. In the report, we go into some detail on some example policy reforms. I won't go into the details here, but they include things like reversing consumerism, recognizing that we can often get caught at the high end in a consumption arms race. We're just consuming more simply to keep up with the Joneses, and we're not. that consumerism is having a negative effect on other things that affect our well-being. We need to expand the common sector of the economy, the social and natural capital, which are not the private part of the economy. We need to create systematic caps on natural resources, things like carbon cap and trade systems, but also extending to other natural resources, and sharing work time. How do we create full employment in a system that's not so devoted to simply working, to create consumption goods that you're using to increase your status. Now, the first objection to this is, well, you can't have an economy that's not growing because everything will just fall apart. We're kind of committed to this kind of system. Peter Victor, in his book Managing Without Growth, created a simulation model of the Canadian economy and asked that very question. And he found that, yes, you could have a no-growth disaster if all you did was stop growth and didn't change anything else. But you could also have a no-growth positive economy where growth leveled off, and all of these things, unemployment, poverty, debt to GDP ratio, greenhouse gas emissions, all were decreased. And we're going in good shape. So I think that's our challenge going forward. How do we create an economy that's not dependent on growth? It's not that growth is a bad thing by itself, but you have to take into account all of the negative components and impacts of that growth, and we have to develop ways to account for those negative impacts and also focus more on quality of life and well-being. So we're kind of addicted, though, to this system, and it's going to take a 12-step program, I think, to get us off that addiction. So here's the 12-step program. New meanings and measures of success, GPI or something like that, and I think there's a lot of interest now in creating a better measures of well-being that are more comprehensive. Limits on materials, energy, waste, and land use. So if we put the appropriate prices on those kinds of resource depletions and then let the market do what it will, I think we'll all be in much better shape. I think there's pretty broad agreement on that. More meaningful prices that would come out of that process. If we start internalizing those externalities in order to get prices that are more meaningful and people can make better decisions. More durable, repairable products. Fewer status goods, so change the focus from status goods to community goods that actually we know now in many cases will have a bigger effect on people's well-being than just more status goods. More informative advertising, advertising that just tells you what you're buying rather than trying to change your values and increase your levels of consumption. Better screening of technology, more efficient capital stock, more local, less global, to reduce the expenditure of energy and other things, moving things around. And also to stimulate community at the local level. I think that's probably an even more important part of it. How do you use the local economy to build social capital? Reduced inequality. We talked about this quite a bit. This is a very direct input to quality of life. Less work, more leisure. Anybody object to this one? Okay, hearing no objections, we'll move on to number 12. Education for life and not just work. Education is not about just getting a job. It's about increasing your human capital, increasing people's ability to interact with other people, increasing their well-being, broadly conceived. So, of course, there will always be skeptics and, what if this is all a hoax and we just create this better world for nothing? So in a sense, this is telling us that we should not focus so much on climate as the problem, on the inconvenient truth, but focus on what does a better world look like, and how do we create that better world, and why would it be better, and why we don't really need to have the levels of consumption in many places that we do have, or at least the types of consumption, And I think that's our challenge. It's going to require breaking our addiction to this growth at all costs paradigm and recognize what the costs are, fossil fuel and overconsumption, and envisioning a more sustainable and desirable future that focuses on quality of life. And that's what we've tried to do in this report, and that also what we're trying to do in this journal, Solutions, that we've brought here to ANU. And I have a few copies up front to show you if you want to see the hard copies. But this is an attempt to create a venue for having this broader discussion about what these solutions might actually look like. What does the world we want actually look like, and how do we get there? So thank you very much.